Chedamashashvatam Anekarthamananarthamanamamam Yaha pratita samadpadam prapanchopashmang shivam Deshyama sambhastang vande vadatavarnam Buddhang gacchami sharanam yavada bodhimandata Dharmang gacchami sharanam bodhisattvaganam tada Sarvasadiksha samvadan prarthayami kritanjalihi Dhanpradipam kurvantu mohadatuk pravadinam Akashasa sataryavadhyavacha jagadastadihi Tavnam siddharbhuya jagat dukkhani nignataha Manjugoshang namasyami yat prasadan mati shubhay Kalyana mitrang vandeham yat prasadach vardate Namastare ture vire tuttare bhayanashini Ture sarvature kale swahankarang namamyaham Ye dharma hetu prabha hetung te shang tadagdodate Te shang chinrodaya bhangvadi mahashramana. Good evening, and delighted to be back. And it's literally a visit in passing. And don't think, just like last time, I did not do much justice to the teaching on 8 verses, I think. Was it 8 verses? So similarly this time, I don't think I'll do justice to Heart Sutra either. But maybe just this short time that we have, just to share some insights on the sutra itself. And I'll try to keep it brief, and then maybe we can have some discussion around that. So I presume most of you have read Heart Sutra at least once. It's a blessing in Buddhist tradition sometimes to have short text, such as the Heart Sutra. Otherwise, it'll be, I think Kabir must have heard this joke before. One of the jokes within Tibetan tradition is that part of the reason we need to reincarnate is just because there are so many volumes to read. Not just to memorize and to learn, just to read. There are various, of course, genres of literature within the Buddhist tradition. And one of the genres is the perfection of wisdom. And legend has it, of course, that the entire perfection of wisdom in 100,000 verses, that Buddha taught it, and then after teaching it, he said that probably in generations to come, people will not understand it. And he entrusted it to the Nagas. And the Nagas decided to take it underwater and until an appropriate time. And then came Nagarjuna, and then the time was appropriate. And so the Nagas handed back the perfection of wisdom to Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna, during his lifetime, of course, expounded on it by writing several commentaries, mostly in the Madhyamika tradition. And perfection of wisdom is also, over the generation, passed in different variations. So we have the 100,000 lines, we have also the 25,000 verses of perfection of wisdom, then we have 8,000 verses of perfection of wisdom. And the 8,000 verses are sort of most commonly circulated bigger text, Ashtasahasrika Prajnaparamita. And then we have the 300 verses, which is also very popular, Vajrachedika, or often referred to as the diamond cutter, which was also, of course, the first printed text. And part of the reason for its popularity was because it was printed, so it circulated very widely in mainland China and other places. And then we have the Kaushikanam Prajnaparamita, which is another abbreviation from 300 verses. Then we have Prajnaparamita Bhagavati, which is the one that the version that I'll be using, which is a very short version of Prajnaparamita. And then, if that wasn't short enough, it was decided that all of it could be distilled in a single letter, A. So if you can simply successfully meditate on the syllable A, you'll have the wisdom of the 100,000 verses of perfectional wisdom. So that was the Buddhist principle of economizing how you shorten certain kinds of teachings and texts. And the syllable A, primarily because it is also a syllable that is used for negation. But symbolically, not just negation, because negation is also a practice of cutting through. So some of you, if you have dabbled in Dzogchen, there are two primary practices, and one of them is the practice of cutting through Tekchut, that is inspired by this meditation on such aspects of the syllable A. So, perfection of wisdom over the years has gone through all these different variations. And it was taught, of course, as the text, the sutra begins, that like several of important Mahayana sutras, then Prajnaparamita was also delivered on Vulture Peak in Rajgrit, Grit-Kuta. And then, depending on which version of the text you read, it will tell you whether there were 1,200 or 12,000 or 120,000 in attendance, just in terms of the monastics who were there. Ancient translators, I guess, did not really worry about adding zeros here and there. So oftentimes, when I was young and at Grit-Kut, I would really try to imagine, just geometrically, how would physics allow for 12,000 people to exist on that tiny mountain peak? But then, of course, the tradition says some were floating and some were in the air and so on. So, an invitation to our imagination and so on. So, Buddha gave Buddha was, as the text opens up, that he was sitting, firstly, in meditation at this Vulture Peak, surrounded by very important bodhisattvas, the disciples, and so on. And oftentimes you get a hint when you're studying a text in terms of the profundity of the text itself, the profundity of sutra itself, depending on how the person says what kind of state was the Buddha in when the teaching was delivered. So here, like most sutras, it begins with, "Thus have I heard." So here the I, depending on which commentator you refer to, most times the I is Ananda. So you know about Ananda. Right? Buddha's cousin, also his confidant, his attendant, and so on. Interesting thing about Ananda is that, when Buddha attained parinirvana and all the first council was held to figure out, what actually Buddha taught. And so the way it was done was, there were 10 senior monks sitting in front. And whoever had heard teachings of the Buddha, they would come in front of him and they would recite that, "Thus have I heard." And then these 10 monks will look at each other and they say, "This sounds right, about right. This sounds right. This is pure fabrication." And that's how they sort of decided what goes into which particular canon and so on. But people who would be recounting what they had heard from the Buddha already had to be arhat, at least, to be able to qualify to say that their power of memorization was at least credible enough to contribute to the Buddhist canon. And everybody knew that Ananda probably was present in most teachings than any of the disciples who were there. But unfortunately, Ananda had not attained Arahata by that time, the first day of the council. And so he was not included to speak and recount what the Buddha had taught. And then it is said that Ananda sort of was a bit disappointed, and he left the council there, and he went into this meditation state. A couple of days later, he emerged with realizations of being an Arhat, and at that point he was allowed to make contributions. So most times when you read the sutra, the I oftentimes is Ananda, unless it's certain parts of Vinaya where the I would refer to Upali, who was more well versed in the Vinaya part of things. Here, because of the nature of Prajnaparamita itself, because although it's a sutra, it has certain Vajrayana elements into it because of having a mantra and a dharani and its usage. So sometimes it is said that the I could be Vajrapani, but oftentimes it is understood that the I is Ananda. And thus have I heard, so Ananda perhaps saying that this is what I have heard. And I think this statement, "Thus have I heard," is very important, and some of you might have actually heard me speak on this thing. That it would have been easier for them to just say the Buddha said so. That the Buddha said so, and just narrate the whole teaching. So why begin with something like "Thus have I heard"? In fact, when you look at most theistic scriptures in the world, it says things like, "and God said," or "the prophet spoke," or "the prophet said." It never says anything like, "I heard the prophet say this," or "thus have I heard." But it has become somewhat characteristic of all Buddhist sutras to begin with this particular phrase, "thus have I heard." And I think it's an invitation for many different things to be considered. Firstly, that it's an invitation for reflection. It's an invitation for reflection in the sense that psychologically, if I told you that Buddha said so, would have a very different implication than saying, "thus have I heard." Why? Because now I'm in between. It allows you more room to be critical. It allows you to have more room to think cautiously, to be thinking carefully about what it is that you're going to be hearing. And I can tell you that most of these people who were trained in oral tradition did not have, as dicey of a memory or hearing ability as I do, or most of us in this generation have. They had tremendous ability to retain things. And just as an example of it, what survives in India today, to even demonstrate that ability to have that mental retention, is classical music. That it's not until last several decades that people started even to write Indian classical music. Prior to that, everything was oral. Even today, most good teachers are oral, teach you orally. And if you're performing in front of your teacher or an expert and you pull a wrong string or you pull a wrong vocal chord, they will let you know that was wrong. That was not part of the segmented raga or whatever it is that you have studied. So people took it very diligently. People took it very sacredly. So here, this notion of "thus have I heard" is more of an invitation to reflect critically, and not to take things just at face value. Otherwise, it would have made more sense for most Mahayana sutras or even Theravada sutras to begin with things like "the Buddha said so," or "the Buddha thus spoke." Prajnaparamita-Hridaya is also unique in the way that it speaks of a particular kind of state of samadhi that the Buddha was in. So it describes as a state as that the Buddha was sitting in Gambhirayang samadhi, that this deep state of contemplation. And it was so deep that the Buddha actually did not speak. That it's one of the few sutras, perhaps one of the two in the entire canon, where it's classified as a sutra, but the Buddha did not speak a word in the beginning. What happens in the setting is Shariputra gets up and begins to ask Buddha certain questions, which is also wonderful in thing about Buddhist tradition, that Buddha, I don't think, ever intended to give any organized teachings. I don't think he woke up during the day and then said, today I'm going to teach on this, or today I'm going to tell people about this thing. That if you look at the nature of the sutra, that all of it is very organic. And much of the categorization of sutras happened much later on, probably even 100, 200 years after Buddha's parinirvana. Because the trend, the ritual was, monks will go out begging, they'll come back from begging rounds, then they will meditate, they will rest a bit. And then there was a time when the disciples will approach Buddha and they will ask questions. And sometimes these questions will be random questions, or sometimes they will appoint somebody to ask questions on their behalf of Buddha. And then Buddha will think about it, he will respond, and we have a sutra. So that's how many of the sutras were taught. And that's why in the sutra tradition, there's no consistency, meaning that consistency is not a forte in Buddhism. You should not look for consistency in Buddhism, because it tells you how Buddha was so pragmatic in terms of having addressed the kinds of mind or the kinds of minds that were present in the audience. Who asked the question? What was the context of asking the question? How should Buddha respond to that particular individual as opposed to somebody else asking the question? So all those things become very relevant and very important when you are studying a sutra. So in this particular context, then Shariputra is asking the question that how should the son or daughter practice the perfection of wisdom, the profound perfection of wisdom. So from the very onset, when you look at the structure of the question, it tells you a few things about the sutra. It tells you that, firstly, that the sutra is bereft of the idea of gender issues, whether it's a male or a female, it doesn't matter. That the sutra is geared towards everybody because the question was asked in that manner. The second thing is that it tells you that the sutra is actually a training manual. Why? Because he's not asking, certain philosophical questions about what Prajnaparamita is. He's asking a very specific question, which is how should a son or daughter practice the perfection of wisdom? And the response accordingly is about the implications of practice in the life of a practitioner. So it's not, you can make, anything cerebral in terms of just having an intellectual curiosity about a particular text or tradition. But perfection of wisdom would serve you best in your spiritual development and practice is when you look at it as a training manual. Just like any other kind of training manual, how to drive a car, training manual. So it's a clear-cut training manual. And here, what happens is something quite curious, which is the sutra says that by the power of Buddha, one of the bala of Buddha, by the power of Buddha, Avalokiteshvrara got up in the assembly and started to respond to Shariputra. So here, Buddha is sitting in the samadhi of Gambhirayang samadhi. He doesn't speak, but he inspires Avalokiteshvrara to speak. Now, this is also kind of intriguing because it's a perfection of wisdom text. Why didn't he ask Manjushri to respond to Shariputra? Why is he asking Avalokiteshvrara to respond to Shariputra? And so you already see that what Prajnaparamita is doing, it's already breaking certain molds that people have already formed about certain things. You see. that firstly, that Shariputra can actually ask an intelligent question. You have to be very thankful to a person like Shariputra. Why? Because he asked questions. If Shariputra wasn't there, we probably would have 25% of the volume of Buddhist literature. He was the guy who asked questions and wasn't afraid of asking questions. So Shariputra asked questions, and by power of Buddha, Avalokiteshvrara is the one who's responding to it. And Avalokiteshvrara, in his response, he's saying, well, this is how a son or daughter should practice the perfection of wisdom.